Misconception that exists in the minds of many people that the Supreme Court operates and functions independently of any outside pressures. They're like supposed to be above and beyond politics. Now, I don't know how anybody could come up with an idea like that, but a lot of people think that. A lot of people think that Supreme Court decisions come from the hand of God. They were written by the Almighty up above. And in 1850, that Supreme Court sat down and said that any slave who escapes from one state or from one section of the country and who goes to another must be returned. That's what they thought about us. In 1857, Chief Justice Taney of the Supreme Court of this country handed down a historic decision that said that black people or black man has no rights which a white man is bound to respect. That was back in 1857, and nothing has changed. That situation has remained the same. Now we come up to this creep by the name of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln said something that was very hip, and we should all take heed of it. He said you could fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And Lincoln should have known, because he did a damn good job of fooling 4 million black people in this country at the time, that when he sat down and wrote that Emancipation Proclamation, that freed us. 4 million of us went for that bullshit. 4 million of us. That's what they ran to us in school. But when we check out history, when we check it out, we find that Abraham Lincoln did not sign the Emancipation Proclamation because he sincerely and honestly felt that black people should be freed. Oh, no, that's not the reason why that chump signed that document. He signed it out of political and economic necessity. That's how it came down. Because when we check out the history of this country, we find that the South at that time, on January the 1st, 1863, when he issued that document, the South was putting fire to the North's ass. They was giving them a righteous ass whipping. Abraham Lincoln and the Northern generals had to come up with a scheme that would in fact diminish the power of the South, that would undermine their military strength. So what did Lincoln did? He sat down and said that all of those states that have broken away from the Union and who refuse to come back, that the slaves in those states are free. Now all we have to do is look at that and we see that that's absolute madness. That's ridiculous. Because first of all, the states had broken away from the Union, the Confederate States. Now, Abraham Lincoln had no power over those states. So how in the hell could he free slaves that he had no power over? He didn't free them. Then it goes on, the contradiction becomes even greater when we check it out, because he said that in those states who had broken away from the Union, but who were coming back and who would be loyal to the Union, they could keep those slaves. They could keep their slaves. So in effect, what he did was he freed those slaves which he didn't have no power to free, and he kept in slavery those that he did have the power to free. And it was, in fact, because of the heroic effort, because of the fighting spirit and the spirit of sacrifice manifested by those 186,000 black men who fought in the Civil War, laboring under the delusion that by fighting and laying their blood down for this country to preserve the Union, that they get some freedom. The only reason why the North won was because of those black soldiers. That's the only reason. And then they came together in Congress. Congress at that time was dominated by the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. At that time, the Republicans had a reputation of being the liberals. They had the reputation of being the radicals, Thaddeus Stevens and all them other funny time chumps. They were supposed to be the revolutionaries at that time. But when we check it out a little further, we find that all of the laws, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that were enacted by Congress, and that supposedly gave black people freedom, that supposedly gave black people the right to citizenship, and that supposedly gave black people the right to vote. We find that none of those laws were passed as a result of a sincere desire on the part of the government of this country to repay to black people what they had stolen from them. No, none of those reasons accounted for what they did. The main reason why we got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment was because at that time the Republicans were representing the interests of the northern capitalists, of the financiers, of the industrialists, and of the bankers. They wanted to control the entire country. They wanted to expand their power. They wanted to move into the West and set up railroads. They wanted to build industries. But they realized in order to do that, they would have to have absolute control of the government. They would have to have absolute control of the government. And as long as the Southern Democrats were in power, that control was impossible. So what did they do? They said, well, we'll give black people the right to vote. We make black people citizens. And behind Abraham Lincoln freeing them, and behind Abraham Lincoln being a Republican, they knew goddamn well that black people would pledge their allegiance to the Republican Party. And that's what we did. That's what we did. They had what they call Reconstruction. Reconstruction. Now, anyone here today who is under the delusion that the problems, the economic, political, and social problems that afflict black people can be solved by way of having black representatives functioning in the traditional political arena, anyone who believes that, all you have to do is look back at Reconstruction. Black people had what was called political representation at that time, and it didn't get us a goddamn place. As a matter of fact, during the Reconstruction era, black people sent two senators to the Senate, and from all places they came from Mississippi. During Reconstruction, there were 20 black representatives to Congress. During Reconstruction, there were blacks who served as associate judges on the state court. There were blacks who served as mayors. There were blacks who served as DAs. There were blacks who served as police commissioners. There were blacks who functioned on damn near every level of the local, state, and federal government. But when the ruling class in this society decided that black people had outlived their usefulness, all they did was they just squashed it all. And despite all of that so-called political representation, despite all of the so-called gains that we made during Reconstruction, despite all of that, when the year 1876 rolled around and it was necessary for Rutherford B. Hayes, who was the Republican candidate for the presidency at that time, when it was necessary for him to capture the necessary votes to win that election, all he did was he formed a deal. He made a deal with the Southerners, and that ended Reconstruction. That squashed that. And the next day we found ourselves in a worse trick bag than we were in during slavery. Slavery had been ushered back upon the stage of American history, and it has remained until this very day. Every dealing, every form of relationship that we have had to this society, that applies to black people, that applies to Puerto Rican Americans, that applies to Mexican Americans, that applies to Indians, that applies to Eskimos, that applies to poor whites, that applies to women. Every dealing that every one of those groups has had with this government has resulted in nothing more than a lot of meaningless promises made, and nothing came of those promises, and the end result was a flim-flam and more persecution and more oppression. Every promise that they've made has only served to put us asleep. In the year 1896, that prestigious and august body, the most powerful judiciary body in the world, the Supreme Court of the United States, sat down, handed down a ruling. It was called the Plesley versus Ferguson decision. A brother by the name of Plesley from down in Louisiana hopped on a train, and he sat in the section that was reserved for whites. And the conductor came along and told him he had to move because black people could not sit in that section. So Plesley took it to court. And when it reached the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal accommodations were constitutional and were fair. That is known as Jim Crow. In 1954, the Supreme Court supposedly squashed the Jim Crow law by outlawing segregated schooling. Here we are 16 years later, and over 90% of the black children in the South still attend inferior and segregated schooling. So that's how much rhythm we get out of the Supreme Court. That's how much rhythm we get out of the Constitution. That's where that's at. Just been fooled too goddamn much and too goddamn long, and their eyes are opening up. Veil after veil of illusion, veil after veil has been lifted from their eyes, and now they're standing and they're taking a cold, hard, objective look at what America is all about. They're looking at that flag up there that they once thought of as being the symbol of freedom, justice, and equality. They're looking at that flag now they don't think of it in those terms. When they look at that flag now, they don't think about freedom, justice, and equality. They think about slavery, racism, oppression, and imperialism. They look at that flag now, And on the other end of the social scale, on the other end of the spectrum, you have those whose mentalities are so perverted and so depraved that they say you can do anything, but just don't spit at my flag. Because if you spit at my flag, I'll kill you. That's insanity. That's insanity. A lot of us are hung up because we can only visualize, we can only see fascism in terms of Nazi Germany or fascist Italy. We can only see fascism, we can only think of fascism when we see herds of stormtroopers rolling down the street, goose-stepping and screaming thunderous Sieg Heils. We can only see fascism when we look up and see an Adolf Hitler. We can only see fascism when we look up and see a Benito Mussolini. And until they see that, a lot of people are going to refuse to believe that America is fascist. Well, all I have to say about that is you can wait for the Sieg Heils, you can wait for the goose steps, you can wait for your Adolf Hitler, and by the time they arrive, it'll be too goddamn late because your ass will have been run into a concentration camp. They don't need no Hitler in this country. They've gone quite a few better than Hitler. While we're talking about Hitler, that brings to mind a statement that Hitler once made. And I suspect that he got the idea from America, because he stood up and said that if a lie is told long enough and strong enough, people in time will begin to believe it. And I'm sure he learned that from America, because America has in fact ran down the longest and the strongest lie ever perpetrated in history. The lie that says America is a free and democratic society. That's the biggest lie ever told, the biggest lie ever told. A lot of people are still talking about the 6 million Jews that the Nazis exterminated. And they have forgotten about the 50 million black people. I don't know how many million Indians. I don't know how many million Mexicans. They're still talking about those 6 million Jews, but they done just shot over the fact that during the era of slavery, America participated in the callous and cold-blooded extermination of 50 million black people. 50 million. And that was just during the era of so-called overt slavery. Now, I don't know how many more have been massacred. I don't know how many more have been lynched, burned, castrated, and murdered since that time up until now. I don't think there's enough numbers to account for it. So we got to stop talking about what America might do, what America might not do, because the fact of the matter is the issue ain't whether America would commit genocide. The reality of the situation is that America has been perpetrating genocide since the year 1607, when them racist bandits first landed on that rock, when they first set foot in Jamestown. They've been doing it since then. We cannot look upon the United States of America as simply being a nation. The United States of America is far more than a nation. It is, in fact, the most ruthless, the most bloodthirsty, the most oppressive, and the most exploitative empire that has ever existed in the annals of history. The United States of America is, in fact, the number one threat to the continued existence of the human race. We have to understand that the forces that are presently in control of this government, and a lot of people think that Richard Nixon is in control of the government. Richard Nixon ain't in control of the government. Richard Nixon is merely a glorified functionary and flunky. When we check out America economically, we find that the wealth of America exceeds that was had by the pharaohs of Egypt. The wealth of America is greater than the wealth of the sultans of Baghdad. It's greater than the wealth of the Pope in the Vatican. And he got 12 billion. He got 12 billion that they know about. You take the wealth of the Rockefellers, which is estimated at being at $7.5 billion. You take the wealth of the DuPonts, their wealth is estimated at being in excess of $7 billion. You take the wealth of the Ford family, their wealth is in the billions. You take the wealth of the Pews who own U.S. Steel. You take the wealth of the Mellons who own Chrysler, Bethlehem Steel, Westinghouse Electric, you name it, they own it. You take their combined wealth and put it together, and the pharaohs of Egypt, the sultans of Baghdad, and the Pope of the Vatican look like welfare recipients. That's what they look like. A so-called great military leader by the name of Dwight Eisenhower quite a few years ago said that we have to watch out for the military-industrial complex. He was down with starting it. And then he came back and said, you got to watch out for it because it's done got out of hand, because it's getting out of hand. That was quite a few years ago. I think just when he left office back in 1960. Here it is 1970 now, and we don't have to watch out for it no more. We got to deal with it because it is in fact the force that controls this country. The power in this country now firmly rests in the hands of the Pentagon. It is in the Pentagon where all of the attacks that are being perpetrated against the Black Panther Party and other progressive and revolutionary forces in this society and the American people in general, it is in the Pentagon where all of those activities are being centrally coordinated, and it is there in the Pentagons that the orders emanate from. It's going down in the Pentagon. So we don't have to worry about them coming to power because they control the society. Between the guns of the Pentagon and the wealth of the ruling families in this society, there exists a plan that is in fact the most barbaric and the most hideous scheme ever thought up in human history. Around the end of, at the end of the World War II, they sat down and they dug that the most wealth, the greatest cash could be made by during times of war. So what did they do? They dedicated themselves to the proposition that they would keep a war going on somewhere on the planet at all times. And what would they do? They would supply the military needs of those who were fighting. They signed military pacts with 42 different countries around the world. They have over 1 million armed forces stationed in over 30 countries around the world. They are waging war all over the world, and at the same time, they're going to stand up and tell people that they are all over the planet enslaving, exploiting, oppressing, and dehumanizing people because they want to make the world safe for democracy and freedom. Anybody who can believe that that's really why the United States has in the last 5 years dropped more bombs on Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam than all of the bombs dropped during World War II, if they can really think that that is being done to make the world safe for freedom and democracy, all we can say is that they are extremely ignorant, because all we have to do is look at the world situation today, and we find that from the islands of the Philippines to the swamps of Southeast Asia to the tropical jungles of Africa to the arid deserts of the Middle East to the Bolivian tin mines to the cities of South America, on up into the colonized ghettos of Babylon, we find that all over the world people have risen up and they're moving like a mighty tidal wave, and they're saying that it is our duty, it is our obligation to humanity to destroy that very force which is responsible for the enslavement of the planet. This is what they're saying. They are saying that whatever must be done to destroy U.S. imperialism and capitalism and racism must be done. They are saying that no longer shall the struggle be waged by way of conducting it according to the rules and regulations laid down by the oppressor. They're saying no longer will they attempt to secure their human right to self-determination by doing it according to the way that the oppressor says it must be done. They're saying now that they will do it by any means necessary. If it means picking up a gun, they pick up the gun. This is what they're saying. And the people of Asia, the people of South America, the people of Africa, the people all over the world, their eyes are focused on the United States of America at this time because they know far better than a lot of us here in Babylon know that the only force, the only power, the only group of people that are capable of dealing a death blow to the monster known as America are those who live right here within the belly of the beast.